Notre Dame moved up to number 4 in the penultimate CFP ranking. So who should you be rooting for this weekend in the conference championships to help set up the best path for the Irish once they're in the playoff? Plus, why I believe this recruiting class that Notre Dame signs today might represent a significant shift in the way that Marcus Freeman builds his roster. This is Locked On Irish.
You are Locked On Irish, your daily podcast on the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome into Locked On Irish, your daily Notre Dame podcast. I'm your host, Tyler Wojciak. I'm a Notre Dame alum and producer at Fox Sports, and thank you for starting your Wednesday, December 4th, right here by making this your first listen of the day. Before we get started, please take a quick second to hit that subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you're listening to the podcast. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started. All right, there is so much to talk about today. I am fired up about it. Not only do we have to react to the penultimate CFP rankings, today is the first day of the early signing period for the class of 2025, and I expect all 23 of the prospects who are currently committed to Notre Dame to make it official and put pen to paper throughout the day. Unfortunately, this class is probably not going to live up to the lofty expectations that me and many others once had for this class, and I'll explain why I think that this could lead to some significant changes for the program down the road. But we are going to save that for segments 2 and 3. Let's begin with what is most important in the here and now, the present, and that is the latest college football playoff top 25 rankings courtesy of the CFP committee. So, right now, you've got Oregon at number 1, Texas at 2, Penn State at 3. Notre Dame moves up to number 4 following Ohio State's loss to Michigan. They fall to 6, right behind Georgia, who's number 5. Tennessee is 7. SMU is 8. Indiana is 9. Boise State is 10. Alabama is 11th. And then Miami looks like they are going to be the first team out in that 12 spot right there, because the Big 12 championship features 2 teams outside of the top 12 right now, Arizona State and Iowa State. They are ranked 15th and 16th respectively, so the winner of that game is probably going to get the 12 seed unless Boise State manages to lose to UNLV in the Mountain West Conference Championship. UNLV is currently ranked 20th. So, plenty of different things that could happen this weekend that are ultimately going to determine the final CFP rankings that determine the college football playoff. Those are going to come out this Sunday, noon Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific. And my biggest takeaway as it pertains to Notre Dame is that they are still 1 spot behind Penn State. I thought that maybe if Notre Dame was able to go out and hammer USC on the road, that would be enough to propel Notre Dame over the Nittany Lions. But even though Notre Dame won that game by double digits, it was a tight game, a touchdown game there late with just under 4 minutes to go. USC had a chance to tie it late before Notre Dame rattled off 2 100-yard pick sixes to make the game a bigger scoring margin in favor of Notre Dame, but it was not enough in the eyes of the College Football Playoff Committee for the Irish to jump the Nittany Lions. So now we know that Notre Dame is in. We know that Notre Dame is going to host a playoff game, but who they play is going to be determined by what happens in the conference championships this weekend. And there's a ton of different scenarios that we could play out, but in my opinion, this is the best case scenario for Notre Dame to set them up with the easiest path, or the path of least resistance once they get to the college football playoff, because once you're in there, man, it is not going to be easy. Even if you play the 12 seed, 11 seed, it does not matter. These teams are going to be playing at their absolute best. But based on all the different matchups that are out there, this is what you should be rooting for in the conference championships, in my opinion, right? This is what I think will set up the best path for the Irish. Number 1, most important thing, I think you need Oregon to smack Penn State. Not just win in the Big Ten championship. You want Oregon to pummel them. And I don't really think that's going to happen because the spread right now, according to FanDuel, Oregon is only favored by 3.5. And you think about the fact that Oregon is number 1, they're undefeated. Penn State hasn't been able to beat a top 5 team in God knows how long. That line, that minus 3.5, it's bait. It's waiting for everyone to jump on Oregon. And the fact that it is so small in that regard, it makes me think that Penn State is going to keep it close. We're going to see, but the reason why Oregon winning big would help Notre Dame out so much because they would get the 1 seed, and then hopefully it would be enough for Penn State to then fall behind Notre Dame, and then Notre Dame would get that highly coveted 5th seed. The 5th seed gets the 12 seed in the first round, so that's great, right? You get the last team in the college football playoff, and if you win that game, then you play the 4 seed, who is going to be either the Group of 5 champ, assuming that it's Boise State, or if UNLV is able to win that game, then you're playing either Iowa State or Arizona State in the second round. So then you would have a pretty easy path all the way down to the semifinals. So that is important. You definitely want Oregon to win big, but the second most important result involves the SEC championship. Notre Dame really needs Texas to win that game. They need chalk at the top. Best case scenario, Oregon wins big, Texas wins as well. The reason why, if Georgia wins this game, they're going to get the 2 seed. And that means Texas is probably going to fall to the 5th or 6th seed, depending on what happens in the Big Ten championship, which means they are going to drop Notre Dame down at least 1, potentially 2, if Penn State and Georgia ends up winning. If both of those things end up happening, Notre Dame is going to drop down to the 7th seed. They're going to have to face the 10 seed in the first round and then a tougher matchup in the quarterfinals. So those are the 2 most important games. It's going to be the ones that everyone in college football is watching this weekend. The Big Ten and the SEC championship, both of those games have huge implications for Notre Dame. Right now, Texas is favored, which is kind of shocking, just in the sense of anyone who watched the game, watch how thoroughly Georgia was able to handle Texas. But when you consider how these teams have been playing as of late, Texas is coming off a really big win on the road against their arch rival, Texas A&M. That was an extremely hostile environment. Notre Dame knows a thing or two about that, playing in Kyle Field at the beginning of the season. But it's hard to beat a good team twice. So that is going to be the task that Georgia is faced with this weekend. But, man, I remember watching that game and just thinking, man, Georgia is so much better than this team. But we'll see, right? There's a reason that Texas is favored. There's a reason that Oregon is favored. So if both those things happen, Notre Dame is going to be in a pretty good spot. As for the ACC championship, I think it would be best for Notre Dame, and really all of college football, unless you're an SEC fan, for Clemson to win by a slim margin, like, say, a field goal, okay? If this happens, Clemson's going to get the 3 seed as the ACC champion, highest ranked one, and hopefully, the College Football Playoff Committee would keep SMU in the playoff over all of those 3 lost SEC teams, which at this point looks like Alabama is the only one of those teams between Alabama, Ole Miss, and South Carolina that has a realistic chance at making the college football playoff, because right now SMU is the only ACC team in the bracket. If Clemson wins, they get that 3rd seed as the ACC champion, and I don't think the committee would penalize a team who made it to their conference championship, who is in the top 12 right now. They're in the top 10. If they lose a slim margin in the conference championship, their reward for making the conference championship, which these conference commissioners tell us is highly important, if their reward for making it to that game and losing by a really slim margin is to be knocked out of the playoff entirely, I think that sets a really bad precedent, and teams are not going to want to make their own conference championship if they're on the bubble, because the penalty for losing is worse than the reward is good if they're able to win that game. But then again, I don't know. We know how people look at the SEC, especially the College Football Playoff Committee. So I'm hoping that if Clemson were to win by a slim margin, SMU would be able to remain in the playoff. They'd probably get that 11 seed. Alabama would then drop out, and that would eliminate one more SEC team. As for the Big 12 championship, it doesn't really matter much. I guess if Notre Dame had to face one of these teams, Iowa State or Arizona State, I'd probably rather face Iowa State because I really like that running back on Arizona State, Scatabo. He scares me, so maybe the best case is to just avoid him. So I guess Iowa State, but the difference there is pretty marginal. In the Mountain West, I do think that UNLV winning would certainly help out a lot of teams, honestly, because one, Boise State would not get that 4 seed bye, and also that team barely lost to Oregon, who is undefeated, who is the 1 seed very early on in the season. And if Notre Dame ends up facing Ashton Genty, you never know. A player of his caliber could go off and end up just putting the team on his back. I still would obviously take Notre Dame against UNLV, Boise State, or any of the Big 12 teams, and even the ACC teams I just mentioned, but I'm just trying to set up the best case scenario. So if all of these things happen, Oregon wins huge, Texas wins, Clemson wins by a slim margin, Iowa State wins, and UNLV wins, this is what the playoff would look like. You'd have Oregon at the 1, Texas at the 2, Clemson at 3, Iowa State at 4. Then that first round, that first home game, the first home playoff game for Notre Dame would be Notre Dame UNLV. Not necessarily the most exciting matchup in the world, but certainly you're feeling good about the Irish's chances in that one. 6 would be Ohio State versus SMU in the 6-11, Penn State IU in the 7-10 game, and then Georgia Tennessee 8-9. And then if Notre Dame were to beat UNLV, which they certainly should, they'd be favored by a lot, they would then face Iowa State in the second round before they would have to take on Oregon if they were able to make it to the semifinals, and assuming Oregon is able to hold their own as well. I think that path sets up really good for Notre Dame. I'm not saying that all these things are going to happen, but if they do, I would feel really good about Notre Dame's chances, and odds are it's probably not going to play out perfectly, but as long as Oregon wins, and if they win big, that certainly helps, and as long as Texas wins, Notre Dame has a realistic shot at the 5 seed or at worst the 6 seed. Things are going to change. It's going to be a really exciting weekend of college football, and I cannot wait. Coming up, as Notre Dame's class of 2025 becomes official, did this group fail to meet the lofty expectations set by Marcus Freeman himself? That's next on Locked On Irish. Today's episode is brought to you by Bettor Together. Hate the team you drafted in season-long fantasy but want to stay in the action? Introducing Bettor Together, the first cooperative daily fantasy platform where teamwork triumphs talent and you can play with your friends, not against them. Pick more or less on real-time player stats, strategize with your partner to boost your odds, and climb the leaderboard together. So grab a friend and join the social daily fantasy movement at Bettor Together. Bettor Together is the first cooperative daily fantasy application. It makes you realize that daily fantasy is fun alone, but like a lot of things in life, it is better with your friends. Plus, it's a great way to stay connected with friends even when you can't watch sports together in person. All you have to do is download Bettor Together now from the App Store and sign up using promo code LOCKEDON for a free $10 entry into any NCAA football or NFL contest. Play with me in the Locked On CFP Saturday Games contest this Saturday. Remember the code LOCKEDON because winning alone is fun, but it's better together. Well, if you haven't been paying close attention, the early signing day might have snuck up on you. It's kind of funny because during the offseason, I talk so much about recruiting, especially in the summer, and then we get into the thick of the season, and I'm so invested in the recaps and the reactions and the takes and the game previews and all that stuff that recruiting kind of takes a back seat on the show. But as we know, it is highly, highly important. And even though the NCAA doesn't call this day National Signing Day anymore because it isn't just one day, but still most of the high school football recruits from around the country are going to make their college choice official today. And at the time of this recording, which is 8:45 p.m. Pacific time on Tuesday night, Notre Dame has 23 prospects verbally committed in the class of 2025, and we expect all 23 to sign with the Irish today. Unfortunately, it appears that those will be the only 23 players to sign with Notre Dame in this class. And other top targets that Notre Dame has been pursuing heavily, especially as of late, guys like 4-star linebackers Matt Framo and Nathaniel Owusu-Boateng, Florida D-line commit Jalen Wiggins, and Michigan tight end Andrew Olesh are all expected to sign elsewhere. And that has been a bit of a theme for Notre Dame recruiting over the past couple months, which is part of the reason why we haven't talked about it a ton on this show. For a class that was ranked number 1 in the entire country a couple months ago, they lost pretty much all their momentum at the end, and now they are going to finish outside of the top 10 across all the major recruiting sites, maybe even the top 15 on some. And barring any last-second shocking commits to the Irish, I think that this is a pretty underwhelming class for Marcus Freeman and Notre Dame. That is my biggest takeaway. It's not bad. It's certainly not great. It's just fine. It's underwhelming relative to the expectations of Notre Dame, right? If this were, IU, who's not middling, obviously, they're good, but they're not used to recruiting at the top of college football, they'd probably be ecstatic with this 12th ranked class. If it were a team like Wisconsin, someone who has been kind of on it for a little bit, they would be really pumped about this class. But this is Notre Dame, a program with the national championship expectations, one who is 11-1 right now and headed to the college football playoff. This class does not live up to the expectations that I had for it, you probably had for it, and certainly Marcus Freeman and the coaching staff had for all of their recruiting classes. And that's a key point here. I'm not just talking about the fan base when I say this is underwhelming. I think that the coaching staff looks at this class as a little bit underwhelming as well. Think back to when Marcus Freeman was first hired as the head coach at Notre Dame, and think back to his introductory press conference. He probably said the word recruiting over a dozen times. That was a massive point of emphasis when he was hired. That's because he placed such a high emphasis on high school recruiting, and that was evident from the moment he joined the staff as a defensive coordinator. He really elevated Notre Dame's defensive recruiting. We saw that at linebacker, and he really took it all to another level, to a point where it felt like finishing in the top 10 wasn't going to be satisfying anymore. He was shooting for top 5 classes. He was supposed to be the guy who was going to actually land those 5 stars that Notre Dame was not able to land before. Things were going to change with Marcus Freeman at the helm. And to his credit, he has certainly elevated Notre Dame's recruiting operation since he has taken over as the head coach. There is no doubt about that. Recruiting has improved. That's evident by how talented and deep this current roster is, despite all the injuries that they've had to face this season. They still finished 11-1, and they're going to the college football playoff in large part to the amount of time and emphasis that Marcus Freeman placed on recruiting and his ability to land some highly coveted prospects. But let's look at the trend here. In his first recruiting class as a head coach, Notre Dame signed the 12th ranked class in the country. They got stars like Jeremiah Love, who's a huge get, Christian Gray, Drake Bowen, Adon Schuler, and Jane Greathouse, all guys who play a key role on this year's team, even in their young careers. His second class as head coach was even better. They finished 9th in the 24/7 Sports Composite, and guys like Bryce Young, Kingston Biliamu-Asa, Leonard Moore, and even Aeneas Williams, to an extent, have been very impactful on this team as true freshmen. So you think that in his third year, now that he's really gotten his feet under him as the head coach of Notre Dame, this team has a bunch of momentum, you would think that they would continue to inch forward to that top 5 class range. But instead, this feels like a step backward. It's currently rated 12th right now on the 24/7 Sports Composite, and that number is likely to fall even more because more players are going to sign with other teams today that could jump Notre Dame in these rankings. And I'm sure some of you are thinking, Tyler, recruiting rankings are wrong all the time. They certainly miss on top players, and 3 stars end up becoming stars. Trust the staff. Fine. That's certainly true. Recruiting rankings are imperfect. But when you look at the top-ranked classes every single year, there is a direct parallel to the teams who win the most. Georgia, Alabama, Ohio State, and Texas have the top 4 classes right now. They also have been 4 of the best programs in college football in recent years. Texas has been sort of a new addition to that group, but Georgia, Alabama, and Ohio State have won the most in college football, and that is because they recruit the best, and that success is evident in these rankings. Stars matter. They're not perfect, but the teams with the most talent usually win, and the teams with the most talent recruit the best. But I do understand that there are some of you who disagree with that. They think that stars don't matter. That's fine. You are free to believe whatever you want. And if you want to put all of your trust in this Notre Dame coaching staff and their evaluations, that's fine too. So let's look at who the Notre Dame coaches prioritized in this class and whether or not they were able to secure the commitment. Let's start at quarterback. It's very clear who the Notre Dame staff wanted. The 5-star, Deuce Knight. They invested everything into him. He had a pretty hefty NIL package offered his way. Notre Dame stuck with him and did not just let him go, even though everyone in the entire world knew that he was going to flip to Auburn during the last couple months before he finally made it official. Notre Dame continued to remain confident. They thought they were going to land him because they thought so highly of him as a player and as a person. He ended up at Auburn. Notre Dame ended up with the 27th ranked quarterback in the class, Blake Hebert. Disappointing result there. At running back, they had commitments from 3 stars, Justin Thurman and Daniel Anderson, for a long time. Notre Dame had a lot of time to recruit running backs in this class because Aeneas Williams and Keidron Young committed to Notre Dame a long time ago. I thought they were going to take some big swings at running back. They did not. They wanted these 2 guys, but then as time passed, Thurman and Anderson, they didn't really progress how Notre Dame's coaching staff thought they would, and they had to just part ways with them a couple months before the signing day. That is a miss there. At wide receiver, where do I even begin with who the coaching staff wanted? Derek Meadows has been the staff's number 1 priority at this position from day 1, 2 years ago. It was very clear that Derek Meadows was their guy. He was not ranked as high as he is now. He was kind of like a 4-star recruit coming out of Bishop Gorman. Notre Dame was all in on him. Then he started lighting up the camp circuit. Then everyone got involved. His recruiting ranking shot up. Now he's committed to LSU. But then it looked like he might flip, and Notre Dame was back in the picture. Now they aren't even in the top 3. He's probably going to end up at Alabama, and behind Alabama, it's probably Michigan and then LSU. So Notre Dame didn't even finish in the top 4 after this entire circus with Derek Meadows. They had Sean Terry, who was committed at one point. He's like a low 3-star. They let him walk because they thought they were going to sign better talent, but guess what? They did not. Dylan Robinson was a top target. He ended up at Washington. Tanuk Hines was a priority at one point. He's going to USC. Jalen Cooper was committed to SMU. He was on campus during the fall. Took a visit during the Stanford game. Felt like Notre Dame was going to land him. He ended up with the Mustangs. Isaiah Mazzell is another guy who they were after. Whiffed on him. Antoine Parham was a recent offer. He's a Tulane commit. He's going to stay with the Green Wave, although I think that there's some other things going on off the field there. Either way, Notre Dame has sent out a bunch of offers to a bunch of other wide receiver prospects, and they were not able to land the guys that they wanted most. I like Elijah Burris. I like Jerome Bettis Jr. Ontavious Richardson is like a nice get. He's never even played receiver in high school. So this is just a big, big miss at a big position of need. At tight end, they are going to sign 4-star James Flanagan, who I really like. He could be a great tight end, certainly has all the tools, but he's a Notre Dame legacy. That was an easy take. Notre Dame wanted 2 tight ends in this class. They had a commitment from 4-star Nate Roberts. He ultimately flipped to Ohio State. Michigan commit Andrew Olesh was on campus for the FSU game recently. Marcus Freeman prioritized him throughout that visit. Notre Dame is not going to land him. He's not even considering Notre Dame in their top 3. Offensive line, they pretty much nailed it. I'll give them that. 4 really talented prospects. I like them all. There's a moment when you thought they could get Jack Lang, but I'm perfectly content with Will Black, Matty Augustine, Cameron Herron, and Owen Strabig. That's a good group. Defensive line is just a giant miss. This is a huge position of need for Notre Dame. They have not been able to land the type of talent necessary at this position, and they failed to do it once again. I like Christopher Burgess Jr. He's a really good player. I honestly think that he's a future NFL guy out of Chicago. That's it. The other 4 are developmental guys who could eventually become good players, but probably need several years to get acclimated to the college game. None of these guys are going to be playing early. They whiffed on in-state stud Damian Shanklin, who's literally just 2 hours down the road at Warren Central. Huge priority from the staff early on. He's going to LSU. CJ May was a 4-star edge rusher who decommitted a while back. He's now going to sign with Louisville. And then late in the process, the staff recognized that they had a huge hole at D-line in this class. They aggressively tried to flip 4-star Florida commit Jalen Wiggins, but he's going to stick with the Gators. At linebacker, the top 2 targets on the board for this coaching staff the entire time they were recruiting linebackers, 4 stars, Man Framo, Nathaniel Uwusu-Boateng. At one point in June, it looked like they were poised to land both. Signing day, probably not going to land either. Man Framo was considered a Notre Dame lean for the longest time, but it seems like he wants to stay home and play for USC. That's tough for Notre Dame. That's a tough break for them. It happens. Sometimes kids don't want to travel that far to go to South Bend, Indiana. I get it, but when you miss on all these other guys, this one that you really thought you were going to get, that stings even more. At cornerback, excellent class, exactly what you'd expect from Mike Mickens. And at safety, pretty decent group overall, but they had a borderline 5-star Ivan Taylor committed for a long time. He eventually flipped to Michigan. Now he's going to Alabama. And even though the defensive back class as a whole is still very strong, if they were able to keep Taylor, this could have been one of the greatest class of defensive backs that Notre Dame has had in a really long time. And I know as I go through all of this, I might sound a little harsh, but I'm just following the coach's moves. I did not talk about the rankings really one single time as I was going through all those top targets. Those are the players that the coaches prioritized the most, and they missed on far more than they actually landed at the very top end. They were able to land a few really talented players, Dallas Golden, Will Black, Marcus Zachary. I already mentioned Christopher Burgess Jr., but they just did not land enough high-end players that's going to get you really excited about this class and the impact that it could make early on. And as good as you were, as good as the season was, 11-1, playoff berth, plenty of momentum for the program. The fact that this is Marcus Freeman's 3rd year, the fact that this is the recruiting class that Notre Dame is going to end up with, especially when they were number 1 in the summer and it felt like they could finally land that top 5 class, it is a bit disappointing. And if I had told you a few years ago when Marcus Freeman was hired, this is the type of class they would be signing, you probably would have said I'd be dead wrong. And I understand that NIL is certainly a part of these decisions with high school guys, but let me make this abundantly clear. Notre Dame has plenty of NIL money. They have 2 collectives now. I would say you compare it to the rest of the teams in college football, they're probably in the top 10 in the amount of money they have to spend. But it's on the coaching staff and some help from the administration, obviously, to choose how they spend that money. So if they're not spending it all on high school recruiting, and just so we're all on the same page, they are spending money on high school recruits. That is not their strategy anymore, where they're only spending it on retaining guys and guys in the transfer portal. There were several prospects who I know were offered money and had quality NIL packages presented to them. They decided to go a little bit different route and compare to some other programs. So, does an unfortunate end to this recruiting cycle stunt all the momentum this team had? Absolutely not. And it actually might represent a significant shift in philosophy for Freeman and his staff going forward. More on that right after this. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 to get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today, and you will get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. And if you've been listening to the show every day this week, you know what I'm using for my first $5 bet. I've got the Packers plus 3.5 against the Lions on Thursday Night Football. It's going to be a great game. Two top teams in the NFC. And I honestly like the Packers in this one. The Lions might win. I think it's going to be really close. They've been on this insane winning streak, but they kind of got lucky last week against the Bears. I think the Packers are going to keep it tight. They might even pull off the win. So I'm taking the Packers plus 3.5. And for more, just visit FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. So as the dust settles on the recruiting class over the course of these next few days in the early signing period, I think it's fair to ask, what is Notre Dame's plan going forward? Because as I said in the previous segment, we didn't really expect to be in this position where Notre Dame would not even have a top 15 class in the entire country, but I think it represents a very significant shift. Here's what I mean by that. Marcus Freeman has said on numerous occasions since he took over as the head coach that his program will be built through recruiting high school players, and I believe him. Right? That should be the case for pretty much every team. It certainly is the case for the best teams, as I mentioned, the Georgias, the Ohio States, the Alabamas. They are recruiting high-end high school talent, and then they fill holes in the transfer portal. Those are the best teams doing it right now, and especially given Notre Dame's restrictions when it comes to adding players in the transfer portal with all the academics, first year of studies that we've gone over on this podcast a million times, that makes even more sense to really focus on high school recruiting. But going forward, I think Notre Dame is going to be more active in the transfer portal than they've ever been in the past, and this class might be the first big indication of that. Notre Dame has been very good at adding impact players in the portal, especially since Marcus Freeman took over. I know a lot of fans aren't in love with quarterbacks like Jack Cohn, Sam Hartman, or Riley Leonard, and I'm not saying that Notre Dame is going to go out in the transfer portal and add their starting quarterback for next year. I don't think that's the case. I think that the quarterback for next year is currently on the roster. But players like Jordan Clark, Javonte Jean-Baptiste, Thomas Harper, hell, even the punter, John Sott, remember him, the legend a couple years ago? They have been huge additions to the Irish over the past couple years. And then there's other guys like Bo Collins, Brandon Joseph, Rod Hurd, and Jaden Harrison who have helped out a lot as well. The staff has hit on their evaluations in the transfer portal far more often than they missed, but there have been some loud misses, like R.J. Oben, the defensive end from Duke, and Caleb Smith, the wide receiver from Virginia Tech, who didn't even get out of spring practice, and he realized, nope, this life was not cut out for him. Notre Dame added 8 players via the transfer portal this past offseason, 9 if you include Tyler Buckner, although he's a walk-on. They added 7 before that. I expect that number to be in the double digits this offseason for sure. And before you freak out, again, I'm not talking about adding a quarterback, but if multiple guys leave, they might be forced into adding a quarterback in the transfer portal just to be the backup, right? Like if CJ Carr ends up being the starter, Steve Angeli might not want to wait. Now you only have CJ Carr, Kenny Minchey, and then Blake Hebert, a true freshman, or maybe Kenny Minchey leaves. Like, it wouldn't shock me if they added a seasoned veteran to come in and be the backup. They're set at running back, but 2 positions that I've already talked about extensively, wide receiver, defensive line, they need a ton of help at those 2 positions, especially for next year. They are set to lose Bo Collins, Chris Mitchell, Jaden Harrison after this year at wide receiver, and odds are they're probably going to lose more guys as well to the portal, like Deion Colsey, Jane Thomas, maybe some of the young guys too, like KK Smith, who's kind of caught up in the depth chart. Like, wide receiver is a position where guys transfer all the time. then on the defensive line, Notre Dame is going to lose Howard Cross. They're going to lose Riley Mills. Jordan Botello is going to be coming back from a major knee injury. Same with Boubacar Traore. We don't know if Jason Onye is ever going to play another game in a Notre Dame uniform. So they are very thin at that position already, and they have to make up for a lot of recruiting misses as well. So they did not really help their cause at either one of those positions in this recruiting class. So they're going to have to be very active in the transfer portal. And I mentioned that Notre Dame has one of the best NIL funds collectives in the entire country. Even though they offered some of that money to the high school recruits, and that's how they got some of these guys to sign and visit and things like that, they have more of it. And I think that they are going to spend that money on transfers and then guys retaining. But when it comes to roster building, I think that they're going to have to add even more. And there have been some rumors that Pete Bavacqua, the Notre Dame administration, they have become more lax when it comes to the restrictions on transfers, where you're not just looking at players who played at Northwestern or Stanford or academically like-minded institutions as Notre Dame to get players. Notre Dame is going to be able to add undergraduate student athletes from highly competitive programs to their own football program, and that is a huge shift. If that's true, which we're all hoping it is, that's kind of been the scuttlebutt, all that stuff. If that is true, then Notre Dame could be very active adding in the transfer portal. They could add multiple starters at some key positions, and maybe that is why they saved some of that NIL money, because even though it's great to have the best recruiting classes, it is definitely a risk if you use a good portion of your NIL money on 17 and 8-year-old kids who might not pan out. And even if they are going to pan out later on, if they're not playing early and they decide to transfer, that is a bad use of money. So when I look at this recruiting class for Notre Dame and I see all the different places where man, you missed out on this top guy or this top guy or this top guy, maybe it is an NIL thing. Maybe they just weren't willing to spend enough. I don't think that's the case for all of them. That's for sure. Like in the case of Deuce Knight, I think Notre Dame offered him a very hefty NIL package, but he wanted to play in the SEC, wanted to get on the field early. Auburn certainly provides the best path for him to do that in that respect. But you look around to that rest of that class, I think that Marcus Freeman is going to be more aggressive in the transfer portal than ever before, and we are starting to see it with this class and a little bit more in the class of 2026. That doesn't mean they're going to neglect high school recruiting. Marcus Freeman is still a dog recruiter. He is going to recruit the high school class aggressively every single year, but when it comes to spending that NIL money, I think that even though they're going to spend some on high school, they're going to spend even more in the transfer portal. So this is a very, very interesting cycle in the transfer portal for Notre Dame, because it technically opens next Monday, but Notre Dame is going to be in the middle of preparing for the college football playoff. And the expectation is going to make that 12-team playoff every single year. I think they're eventually going to move that transfer portal window, because right now it's December 9th through December 28th, and hopefully Notre Dame is playing throughout that time. So I don't expect many players who are currently on the roster to enter the portal for Notre Dame, because if they do, they aren't going to be allowed anywhere near this team during playoff prep. Marcus Freeman is not going to let that fly at all. And I'm sure that they're not going to be adding guys at key positions during this cycle, at least while they prepare for the college football playoff, because that could set a weird tone in the locker room, right? Because Notre Dame goes out there and they add a couple key wide receivers, and then the young wide receivers in the room are like, wait, hold on. What's my role for next year? Well, they're still playing this season and ready to play the biggest game of the entire season, the college football playoff. That just sets a really weird vibe around the entire program. So this is going to be really interesting to see how Notre Dame handles this, because it seems like this was the plan all along based on how things shook out here in the class of 2025. So this might be Notre Dame's new strategy going forward, to prioritize the portal more than they have in the past, but that doesn't come without its risks, especially at positions like wide receiver and defensive line, because it's way easier for Notre Dame to develop those guys in-house and become great players than to go out in the transfer portal and find them. Because if quarterbacks are the most expensive position you can get in the portal, defensive line is right there at number 2, because every team in the country wants to get D linemen in the portal. And even though I've been hard on the staff today in terms of how they finished in this recruiting class, they have built up enough equity to be given some benefit of the doubt when it comes to their evaluation and their way of building this roster. So they have to land guys in this portal cycle, or it might be a struggle next year. That schedule is an absolute gauntlet at Miami, Texas A&M, at Arkansas, Boise State, NC State, even Syracuse and Pitt. Those last 3 teams could be tricky. It is not going to be an easy schedule. They need to reload at several key positions, and this roster has some holes to fill. They're going to have to do it in the portal, and they need to figure out how they get some younger guys in there so that they're not just flailing for grad transfers every single cycle. It's nice when you can develop some guys in-house, and we're going to see, because I feel like for the past couple of years, you've been hearing some things at Notre Dame. This is going to get more young guys. It hasn't always been the case, but this appears to be a crossroads for Notre Dame and the way that Marcus Freeman and his staff build their roster, and we're going to have to just wait and see how things shake out over the course of these next couple of weeks. But that is going to do it for today's episode. We're going to continue with more signing day coverage in tomorrow's episode once the class is finalized, right? Like, I'm calling this a preview because none of these guys have officially signed it at the time of this recording. I'm sure there's going to be some moving and shaking around in the rest of the college football. So tune in tomorrow. Locked On Recruiting Insider Brian Smith is going to stop by, deep dive on this class, and I'm excited to hear how he's going to grade it too. Then on Friday, it's the return of the Friday mailbag, so get your questions in. You can drop below in the YouTube comments, send them in on social media. The X account is @LockedOnIrish. Instagram is @LockedOnIrishPod. Also, please subscribe on YouTube or wherever you listen to the podcast. Plus, give this video a like, rate the podcast 5 stars, leave a review, subscribe, all that good stuff. Have a great day, everybody. I'll see you tomorrow.